This is the second instructional video explaining how to use the 2014 MPAT Excel spreadsheet. In the first video, we gave you a general overview of the spreadsheet and of the different tabs shown here at the bottom and what their function was. Basically, we showed you how users can enter data into the household data and village data tabs, and the spreadsheet will in turn calculate results for every household and in turn for every village. In order to make this clearer and also to explain to users how they can customize MPAT, we're going to use one question and one subcomponent to illustrate once again how this works, that is, how the indicators are calculated and how the values and weights may be changed if desired. Again, we encourage users to customize MPAT, but this process requires some care and caution, and the publication, the 2014 User's Guide, should be consulted closely, as well as the instructions here and here on the Quick User's Guide tab. So let's start first by thinking about one question from the MPAT Household Survey. So again, we're now looking at the Household Data tab. The spreadsheet comes preloaded with data from 2 villages. Each row corresponds to data from one household. For simplicity's sake, we're going to look at the first row, which corresponds to the data from household 1, which is in village 1. Now let's look at question 23. So if we scroll to the right until we arrive here at question 23. As we can see from the color coding and also from the user's guide and other materials available on the website, question 23 contributes to the component on sanitation and hygiene. So here we're in the values tab. We see sanitation and hygiene, the first subcomponent, toilet facilities, and that is composed of 2 questions, question 23 and question 24. If we look at the household survey, we see question 23 asks, what type of toilet facility does your household usually use? In this case, in the case of household 1, they have responded with 11. So the actual response they provided was that they have an enclosed pour flush toilet which is private, meaning it's used by 1 or 2 households only. This corresponds to answer choice 11 on the pre-coded list of responses on the household survey. The same household for the next question, 24, over the last 12 months, how often was the toilet usable, responded that it was always usable. And this is coded as 5, always. So now we understand the responses for these 2 questions on the MPAT household survey, which in turn are the 2 questions that make up this toilet facility subcomponent. So now let's look quickly at how this works and how it can be customized. So again, here on the Values tab, this provides the values for every question organized by the components and subcomponents. So here again, we see for question 23, if the answer code is 11, it receives a value of 9. Again, 10 being the high value and 1 being the low value. Similarly, for question 24, we see the response 5, always, receives the highest possible score of 10. So if we now go to the Household Results tab, we'd expect to see a high score for this household. And again, we do. So the first row here is for household number 1, and here we see the results for the sanitation and hygiene component and the toilet facility subcomponent, and the household receives a score of 94. Now, let's see what would happen if we change the response. So we go back to the household data tab, and let's assume for a moment that instead of an enclosed pour flush toilet, which was privately used, they had access to an open pit communal latrine. This would correspond to answer choice 2. So if we change this cell to a 2 and then visit the Values tab, we see here that answer choice 2 receives a value of 2, which is a relatively low value. So we would expect when we go to the Household Results tab that the score would have decreased, and indeed it has. It has decreased to 52. Now to get a better understanding of how these 2 questions are combined, so we know now what the values are for these 2 questions, but we want to understand how they are combined to provide us this score. So we can visit the Weights tab. The Weights tab shows us the weights used to aggregate or to combine all of our subcomponents into components. So if we scroll down, so we know we're interested in the sanitation and hygiene component here. And if we look, we see that these are the three subcomponents that contribute to that score. So focusing on the first one, toilet facility, we see indeed this is comprised of data from two questions, as we just saw, question 23 and 24. Question 23, according to the standardized MPAT, is given the priority and a weighting of 60%, meaning the type of toilet the facility uses is more important to the score than how often it is usable. So this is 60% and this is 40%. So that's how these two questions, those two responses, are assigned values based on this table, combined based on these weights, and then this provides us our result here. So let's return this back to the original response of 11. And just to check, we see here, again, this is returned to the score of 94. Now let's say that we feel, for some reason, in this community, an enclosed pour flush toilet that's private is actually not very good, considering the objective of this component, which is focused on sanitation and hygiene. Again, this is not an accurate example, but we're using it just to make an illustration. So let's change this value. Instead of a 9, let's say actually it should receive a value of 5. Now the way this would be done, and the MPAT User's Guide publication goes into much more detail, is you should put together a group of stakeholders and local experts to decide what more appropriate context-specific values and weights would be for your area. In this case, again using the example, we changed the value to a 5. The Excel spreadsheet will show us the standardized value to the right and our new adjusted value. If we return now to the results for this household, we would expect the score would go down. And indeed it has, to 70. Now, let's change this back to the original value. And let's, just for illustrative purposes, so here for question 23, 11 receives a relatively high value of 9, and 5 receives the highest value of 10. Let's change this to rarely, meaning that the toilet facility is rarely usable. So now for question 24, we see that if we changed it to a 2, it gets a response of 2, and as we'd expect, the result for the household decreases to 62. Now the last example I'd like to show you has to do with the weights. So just to review, we're still looking only at these two questions, 23 and 24, which contribute to the subcomponent on toilet facilities, 23 and 24. And we know how each answer code, which value corresponds to that answer code. So again, we know here that this answer 11 receives a high value and this answer 2 receives a low value. We also know how they are combined, 60% and 40%. So again, just to illustrate how this works and how it might be changed, let's say in this case and context, you decided in customizing it that in fact question 24 was more important and should receive a weight of 90%. So here we can change the value for question 23 to 10% and it automatically changes question 24 to 90%. The way the Excel sheet is constructed, it will always make sure that the weights for any given subcomponent must sum to 100. And if you scroll to the right, you can see what the standardized values were. So now we're saying that the priority, the bulk of the weight, should be given to the response from question 24. And since we know here that question 24 receives a low value, we would expect the result to decrease, and indeed it does, to 27%. So just to really drive this point home, let's assume that we are not interested in whether the toilet is usable or not, and we want 100% of the value from this question to be derived from question 23. So in this case, again, for question 23, the response was an 11, and we know that receives quite a high value at 9. And so, as we would expect, the result is 90. This is quite linear, so you can see that for this household, if the response is 11, the corresponding value is 9, and it's given 100% of the weight. And for the results, we simply scale it up from a scale of 1 to 10, to a scale of 10 to 100. So a 9 becomes a 90. So hopefully this example has shown you how, not only how this MPAT Excel spreadsheet works, but also how users may change the values and weights. Again, great caution must be used when doing so, and users should consult the MPAT User's Guide publication before beginning this.